For 30 days, he braved the merciless mountains alone, fighting hunger, evading predators, and clinging to hope. A German shepherd's unbreakable spirit led to a fate no one could have imagined. The world beyond the ridge was an unrelenting expanse of towering mountains, their jagged peaks piercing the heavens like the teeth of some ancient slumbering beast. The sky above was a merciless gray, heavy with the threat of another storm, and the wind howled through the valley below like a wounded creature, carrying with it the whisper of ice and desolation. Snow covered everything, stretching for miles in every direction, a frozen wasteland untouched by time. And in the middle of it all, a lone figure moved. Max was a German shepherd, his thick coat of sable and black now dusted with frost, his breath curling in the frigid air like ghostly tendrils. His muscles ached from exhaustion, his paws cracked from the relentless ice, but still, he pressed forward, his nose low to the ground, searching, always searching. For days, maybe weeks, he had been alone, though time had lost its meaning in this desolate place. The wind had become his only companion, whispering against his ears, trying to push him back, urging him to give up. But he wouldn't. Because somewhere beneath this endless blanket of white, beneath the crushing silence of the mountains, his master was waiting for him. Ethan Cole. A man who had once been more than just an owner. He had been Max's world. A wilderness guide, Ethan had spent his life navigating the treacherous beauty of the mountains, leading climbers and thrill-seekers through nature's unforgiving domain. He had an innate connection to the wild, moving through it with the practiced ease of someone who understood both its dangers and its wonders. But he had never been alone. Max had been there. From the moment Ethan had pulled him from the wreckage of an old barn, a tiny, shivering pup covered in dust and trembling in the aftermath of a storm, their bond had been forged in something deeper than mere companionship. Ethan had scooped the pup into his arms, shielding him from the cold, and in that moment, Max had found his purpose. He had grown into Ethan's shadow, following him through every climb, every storm, every trial. He had learned the lay of the land, memorized every scent and sound, felt the shift in the wind before a storm rolled in. Ethan had trained him with patience and care, shaping him into more than just a pet. Max had become his protector, his partner, his tether to the world, when the mountains grew too vast and silent. At night, by the fire, Ethan would run his fingers through Max's thick fur and talk to him as though he were human. "You're different, you know," he would say, his voice a quiet murmur against the crackling embers. "Not just a dog. You've got an old soul, Max. Maybe you were meant to find me." Max would listen, eyes half-lidded, content in the knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be. But then, the avalanche had changed everything. It had come without warning, a sudden roar that split the world apart. One moment, they had been traversing the ridge, Ethan leading a small group of climbers, Max trotting faithfully beside him. The next, the mountain itself had awoken, shifting violently beneath them. Max had sensed it a second before it happened. His ears had pricked, his body gone rigid with instinctive dread. He had turned, just in time to see the wall of snow and rock crashing down. And then, Ethan was gone. Max had scrambled toward the place where he had last seen his master, barking wildly, his voice lost in the fury of the storm. The avalanche had swallowed everything, burying the path beneath a suffocating weight of ice and silence. When it was over, when the world had finally stopped trembling, there was nothing left but a deep, endless stretch of white. Max had dug. Until his paws bled, until his breath came in ragged gasps, he had clawed at the snow, desperate to unearth the man who had saved him all those years ago. But the mountain was vast and merciless, and Ethan, his scent lost beneath layers of ice, was nowhere to be found. Still, Max had waited, because Ethan had always come back. During every climb, every dangerous trek, every time he had disappeared into the unknown, he had always returned. Max had learned to trust it, to trust him. So he had stayed, sitting by the last place he had seen him, his ears trained for the sound of a voice calling his name, his eyes locked onto the horizon. But the days had stretched into nights, and the snow had fallen again, erasing the traces of the past. The hunger had come first, a gnawing ache that twisted his stomach and made his limbs weak. Then the cold had settled in, deeper than ever before, creeping into his bones like a slow, insidious poison. And still, he did not leave. Because loyalty was not a choice, it was a promise. And Max had never broken a promise. The sky above darkened, the heavy gray clouds beginning to swirl with the slow, deliberate promise of another storm. He had to move. Instinct told him to find shelter, to seek warmth before the night claimed him, but his heart fought against it. He turned, nose to the ground, searching once more for the familiar scent that had guided him all his life. It was faint now, fading with each passing storm, but he still held on to it, refusing to let go. A howl echoed in the distance, a lonely, desperate sound. Wolves. Max's ears flattened. He had seen them before, their glowing eyes watching him from the darkness, their bodies sleek and hungry as they prowled through the snow. He knew their hunger, knew the sharp gleam of their teeth, the way they moved as one. They were hunters, bound by instinct, driven by the endless cycle of survival. And Max was alone. He could feel their presence now, lingering beyond the trees, watching, waiting. A test. They were waiting to see if he was weak enough to fall. Max lifted his head, his own breath curling in the freezing air. He did not back away. He did not falter, because he was still Ethan's dog, still the guardian of the man who had once saved him. And if he had to fight to keep that promise, to hold on to the last remaining thread of the life he had known, then he would. A gust of wind howled through the valley, sending another flurry of snow cascading through the air. The storm was coming. The wolves would not wait forever. But neither would Max. He turned, muscles coiled beneath his thick coat, and ran. Not away. Forward. Because somewhere, out there, Ethan was still waiting for him. And Max would find him. No matter what it took. The wind had turned against him. It slashed through the valley with a merciless force, carrying ice and snow in its grasp, battering Max from all sides. Each step through the deepening drifts was a battle, his paws sinking into the frozen earth as he forced himself forward. The hunger had settled deep inside him now. Not just in his belly, but in his bones. A cold, hollow ache that gnawed at his strength. And yet, he did not stop. Because stopping meant giving up. And Max had never given up. Ethan was out there. He had to be. The storm had come in the dead of night, rolling over the mountains like a living thing, swallowing the land whole. Max had taken refuge beneath a dense outcropping of rock, his body curled tight against the snow, his ears twitching at the distant sounds of shifting ice. The wind carried the cries of the wilderness, cracking branches, the distant howl of wolves, the eerie groan of the mountain settling into itself. And then something else. A sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, nearly lost beneath the storm's fury, but Max knew it the moment he heard it. A voice, weak, fractured, a single desperate cry carried by the wind. Max's head shot up, ears high, his breath stilled, his body going rigid with the force of his focus. It had been so long since he had heard Ethan's voice, so long since he had heard anything but silence. Had the mountain finally given him a sign? Or was this just another cruel trick of the storm? He couldn't take that chance. Max surged forward, his body shaking off the stiffness of the cold, his instincts sharpening. He pushed through the wind, his legs burning with exertion, his senses guiding him toward the sound. He knew these mountains, knew how the wind carried voices, how echoes could twist and turn through the valley. He listened, adjusting his course, sniffing the air for something, anything, that could tell him he wasn't imagining it. Then, he found it. A scent. Faint, almost lost beneath the sharp bite of ice and rock, but it was there. Ethan. Max let out a sharp bark, his tail rising with determination, his body surging forward with new energy. His mind was a blur of urgency and hope, pushing through the storm with reckless abandon. His paws slipped against the ice, his breath came in harsh, ragged bursts, but he refused to slow. The scent grew stronger, and then, the ground vanished beneath him. Max barely had time to react as he plummeted forward, the earth giving way in a violent collapse. The world spun, snow and rock tumbling alongside him as gravity tore him downward. He twisted mid-air, his body instinctively bracing for impact, and then, pain. He hit hard, his body slamming against the frozen ground. Snow exploded around him, a cloud of white swallowing the air. For a moment, everything went still. Max lay there, dazed, his limbs trembling. His breath came in shallow, pained gasps. Something was wrong. His hind leg throbbed viciously, the sharp sting of injury radiating through him. But pain didn't matter, because he wasn't alone. A sound, weak and barely audible over the wind, came from nearby. A voice. "Max!" "Ethan!" Max's heart surged. He forced himself up, gritting against the pain, his paws slipping slightly as he pushed forward. His head snapped from side to side, his eyes scanning the darkness. And then, there, half buried beneath the snow, tangled in broken branches and ice, was Ethan. His body was limp, his skin pale beneath the bruises and frostbite. His right leg was twisted unnaturally beneath him, and his breath came in short, labored bursts, his chest barely rising with each inhale. Snow clung to his face, his lashes dusted with ice, and his lips were cracked from the cold. But his eyes, when they fluttered open, when they finally focused on Max, still held that same unwavering determination. Max let out a broken whimper, pushing toward him, nudging his master's face with his muzzle. Ethan's lips trembled into something that might have been a smile, his fingers weakly brushing through Max's fur. You found me." Max whined again, pressing closer, his body curled against Ethan's, trying to share what little warmth he had left. He could feel the violent shiver running through Ethan's body, the weakness in his limbs. Ethan was hurt. Badly. And if Max didn't do something soon, he wasn't going to make it. Max turned his head sharply, scanning their surroundings. They had fallen into some kind of crevice, the walls of rock and ice rising high above them. The way out wasn't impossible, but Ethan, he wouldn't be able to climb, not like this. Max let out a short, sharp bark, pressing his forehead against Ethan's shoulder. "Stay." Ethan exhaled a laugh, a tired, pained sound. "You're giving me orders now?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Guess I deserve that." Max didn't hesitate. He turned, limping slightly on his injured leg, and launched himself upward. His claws scrabbled against the ice, his muscles screaming in protest, but he pushed forward, scaling the rocky incline with sheer determination. The wind howled around him as he reached the top, the storm threatening to steal his footing, but he stood firm. His eyes darted over the endless white expanse. Help. He needed to find help. Max lifted his head, inhaled deep, and let out the loudest, most desperate howl of his life. The sound split through the storm, rolling across the mountains, carried by the wind. Again he howled, his voice raw with urgency, his body trembling with effort. Silence. Then, an answer. Faint, distant, but there. A human voice. Max barked again, over and over, his tail high, his ears pricked. He saw movement then, a small group of figures pushing through the snow, bundled in heavy winter gear, their faces shielded against the storm. Max didn't wait. He ran toward them, his body screaming in exhaustion, his leg barely holding his weight, but he ran. The figures saw him, one of them calling out, their voices carried by the wind. A rescuer. Max skidded to a halt in front of them, barking frantically, his body vibrating with urgency. He turned sharply, looking back toward the crevice, then back at them, repeating the motion, trying to make them understand. One of the rescuers, his jacket marked with an emergency medical insignia, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "He's trying to lead us somewhere." The others exchanged quick glances, nodding. "Let's go." Max didn't wait. He turned and sprinted back, hoping that they were following. And for the first time in 30 days, he wasn't alone anymore. He had found Ethan, and now he was bringing him home. Max had never run this hard before. His paws barely felt the ice beneath them, his breath coming in short, desperate bursts. The rescuers followed, their voices sharp and urgent as they called into their radios, barking out coordinates and medical codes. But Max couldn't focus on them. His world had shrunk to a single, all-consuming mission. Ethan was waiting for him. The storm had thickened, swirling snow around them in chaotic gusts, making visibility nearly impossible. Max's fur was crusted with ice, his injured leg barely holding beneath him, but he forced himself forward. Every second mattered. Every heartbeat was a countdown. He reached the crevice first, skidding to a stop at the edge, barking furiously. Below, Ethan was barely visible, his body half buried in the snow, unmoving except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. The rescuers arrived seconds later. One of them, a man with a thick winter coat and sharp eyes, dropped to his knees beside Max, shining a flashlight into the pit below. His breath hitched. "There!" he called. "He's alive!" The others moved quickly, unrolling ropes, securing harnesses. Max paced the edge, his muscles taut, his eyes locked onto Ethan's still form. "Hurry! Hurry!" A rescuer was lowered down, his boots kicking up small flurries of snow as he landed beside Ethan. He pressed gloved fingers to his throat, his face grim. "He's hypothermic, legs broken. We need to move fast." Max whined low in his throat, every fiber of his being screaming for them to hurry. The rescuer secured Ethan with careful, practiced hands, wrapping him in an insulated thermal blanket, attaching him to the harness. And then, inch by inch, they lifted him. Max's tail stilled, his breath catching as Ethan's body was pulled from the depths. His head lolled to the side, his face slack with exhaustion, but he was breathing. That was all that mattered. When Ethan finally reached the surface, Max was there in an instant. He pressed his nose against his master's cheek, his whimper barely audible over the wind. Ethan's eyelids fluttered weakly, his lips parting in a barely-there whisper. "Max?" Max let out a soft, broken sound, nudging him again, as if willing warmth back into him. The rescuers didn't waste time. They lifted Ethan onto a stretcher, strapping him in tightly, their movements efficient but gentle. Max stayed close, his body brushing against the stretcher as they carried Ethan down the slope, back toward safety. But the mountain wasn't finished with them yet. A distant rumble cut through the wind. The rescuers froze. Max's ears shot up. Then, the ground shifted. A wall of snow roared to life above them, the mountain exhaling one final breath of destruction. An avalanche. Again. The rescuers cursed, their voices frantic. "Move! Move! Move!" Max barely had time to react before the world collapsed around him. Snow crashed down in a suffocating wave, the sky vanishing in a swirl of white. Max ran, his instincts screaming at him to stay with Ethan, to protect him, but the avalanche was faster. The rescuers were shouting, their figures disappearing into the chaos. And then, silence. Max was buried. For a moment, all he could feel was the crushing weight of snow, pressing in from every direction, stealing the air from his lungs. Darkness swallowed him whole. Panic clawed at his chest, but Max fought it down. He had been trained for this. He had dug through snow before. He had clawed his way out of worse. He would not give up now. Summoning every ounce of strength, Max began to dig. His paws scraped against the ice, his muscles burning with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He pushed forward inch by inch, ignoring the cold seeping into his bones. And then, light. His head broke through the surface, gasping for breath. Snow clung to his fur, ice stinging his skin, but he was free. And Ethan? Max's heart seized. The stretcher, the rescuers, where? Then he saw them, a few yards away, partially buried but alive. The rescuers were pulling themselves free, their hands shaking, their breaths coming in harsh gasps, and in the center of it all, Ethan, still strapped to the stretcher, covered in snow, unmoving. Max's world narrowed. He lunged forward, ignoring the pain screaming through his leg, and reached Ethan's side. His breath ghosted over his master's face, searching for movement, for warmth. And then, finally, Ethan groaned. The sound was barely there, but it was enough. Max let out a sharp, relieved bark, licking at his frozen cheek. One of the rescuers coughed, shaking off the snow. "He's still with us," he rasped, reaching for his radio. "Base, come in. We're alive, but we need an evac now." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. "Chopper's en route. Hold tight." The storm was still raging, but they weren't alone anymore. Help was coming. Max curled up beside Ethan as they waited, his body shielding him from the wind. He would not leave his side. Not now, not ever. Minutes passed like lifetimes, and then, the distant hum of helicopter blades. Hope. The rescuers lit flares, their red glow piercing the whiteout. The helicopter circled once, then began to descend, fighting against the wind. Ropes were lowered. Medics rappelled down, moving with urgent precision. Ethan was lifted first, secured into the chopper, his body shrouded in layers of thermal blankets. Then one of the medics turned to Max. "We're taking him to the hospital," she said gently. "You did good, boy, but we need to get you warm too." Max hesitated. He didn't want to leave. As if sensing his hesitation, the rescuer gave him a small smile. "Come on, hero. He's gonna need you when he wakes up." That was all Max needed to hear. He leapt into the chopper, settling beside Ethan as they lifted into the sky. The storm raged below, the mountain shrinking beneath them. And Max, for the first time in 30 days, let himself rest, because he had done it. He had brought Ethan home. The rhythmic thrum of the helicopter blades filled the cabin, a steady mechanical heartbeat that seemed to tether Max to reality. His body ached, his muscles screaming with exhaustion, but he didn't move. He stayed pressed against Ethan's side, his warmth the only thing keeping him from sinking into the cold that still gripped him. Ethan hadn't spoken since they'd lifted off. Max's eyes flicked up to the medics working over him, their hands moving with urgency. One of them checked his vitals. Another adjusted the IV line running from his arm. His face was pale, his lips cracked, his body unmoving except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. But he was alive. That was all that mattered. The medic closest to Max caught his gaze and offered a small smile. "You're not leaving his side, huh?" she murmured, reaching out to brush a hand over his snow-crusted fur. "Good boy." Max didn't move, didn't blink. He was listening to every shift in Ethan's breath, every beep of the machines monitoring his fragile pulse. He could still feel the cold sinking into him, but it didn't matter. Nothing else mattered. The flight felt both endless and too short. Before Max could fully process it, the helicopter was descending, bright hospital floodlights cutting through the storm outside. The moment they touched down, the back doors were wrenched open, and a rush of cold air swept through the cabin. Paramedics flooded in, their movements swift and efficient as they transferred Ethan onto a waiting stretcher. Max tried to follow, but a firm hand stopped him. "Hold on, buddy." A medic knelt in front of him, her voice soft but commanding. "You need to get checked out too." Max whined low in his throat, his body tensing as he tried to push forward, but the medic held him back. Ethan was disappearing into the hospital doors. Max's heart pounded, panic rising like a tidal wave. Number. He couldn't let Ethan out of his sight. Not now, not after everything. The medic seemed to realize this, her grip loosening slightly. "I promise, he's in good hands," she murmured. "Come on, let's get you warmed up." Max hesitated for only a second before allowing them to guide him into the hospital. The warmth inside hit him instantly, his frozen limbs protesting as the sudden shift in temperature sent a violent shiver through his body. He was led into a separate room where another team of medical staff met him, hands pressed against his fur, checking for injuries, murmuring soft reassurances he barely heard. But his mind was elsewhere. Ethan. Max strained his ears, trying to pick up any sound from the other side of the hospital, but there was nothing. And for the first time in 30 days, he felt helpless. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Max had never been without Ethan for this long. Even in the past, during dangerous treks, they had always found each other. But now, separated by walls, by sterile hospital air, by machines and people who didn't understand, Max felt lost. His ears drooped, his tail curled against his aching body. For the first time, doubt began to creep in. What if he was too late? What if Ethan never woke up? A soft voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "Hey there, buddy." Max's head shot up. It was the medic from the helicopter. She crouched beside him, her expression gentle. "He's stable," she said, as if reading the desperate questions in his eyes. "They're working on him now, but he's got a fighting chance." Max exhaled shakily, his body sagging with relief. "He's asking for you." Max's ears pricked. The medic smiled. "Come on." Max was on his feet in an instant, pain and exhaustion forgotten. He followed her through the hospital halls, past bright lights and hurried voices, his heart pounding harder with each step. Then, at last, the door opened. Ethan lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, his face still far too pale, but his eyes, his tired, heavy-lidded eyes, were open, and they were looking right at him. Max let out a choked sound, something between a bark and a whimper, and surged forward. He barely felt his own weight as he leapt onto the bed, careful but desperate, burying his face into Ethan's chest. Ethan's weak, trembling fingers curled into his fur. "Hey, buddy," Ethan rasped, his voice hoarse but filled with something Max recognized instantly. Love. Relief. Home. Max let out a long, low whine, pressing closer, as if trying to mold himself into Ethan, as if he could somehow make up for the weeks of separation in this single moment. Ethan chuckled weakly, his hand tightening slightly. "You saved my life." Max only pushed closer, his eyes squeezing shut. "I knew." Ethan exhaled shakily. "I knew you'd find me." Max let out a small, broken sound, as if to say, "Of course I did." Because there had never been any other option. Ethan was his, and he was Ethan's. No force in the world, not storms, not avalanches, not time, could ever change that. They had found each other. And this time, nothing would take them apart again. The world beyond the hospital walls had moved on without him. Ethan had spent weeks confined to the sterile, white-walled room, surrounded by beeping machines and hushed voices. He had watched storms roll across the sky through the window, had seen the seasons begin to shift, but he had not been part of it. His body had been too weak, his mind too clouded with exhaustion and pain. But now, finally, he was leaving. Max trotted beside him as he moved carefully down the hospital hallway, his legs still in a brace, his body still adjusting to the weight of movement. The doctors had wanted him to use a wheelchair, but Ethan had refused. He had fought too hard to survive. He would stand. The hospital staff had long since stopped trying to separate Max from his side. "He's not just a dog," one of the nurses had whispered to a new staff member as they watched Max pace beside Ethan, always within reach, always watching. "He's a guardian." Ethan didn't need to be told that. He already knew. Every step was slow, painful, but Max was there, his body pressed just close enough to steady Ethan when he faltered, his warmth grounding him. And when Ethan finally stepped through the hospital doors, into the crisp, pine-scented air of the outside world, Max let out a low, contented breath. They were free. Ethan moved carefully toward the waiting vehicle, wincing as his leg protested, but he kept going. Max was the first to climb in, settling into his usual spot beside the passenger seat, his eyes locked onto Ethan's every movement. As they drove away, Ethan let out a slow, shaky breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Home. The word felt both foreign and familiar. The ride was quiet, the road stretching endlessly before them, winding through forests and hills that Ethan had once known like the back of his hand. It had been a long time since he had seen this world without the threat of death lingering at his back. But the mountains, his mountains, were still there, their peaks touching the sky, their ridges dusted with fresh snow. He had nearly become part of them, but Max had refused to let that happen. Ethan reached out, resting a hand on Max's head, his fingers curling into the thick fur. "We made it, buddy." Max let out a small huff, as if to say, "Of course we did." Because failure had never been an option. Not for them. The cabin felt untouched, preserved in time as though waiting for them to return. The wooden floors creaked beneath Ethan's careful steps, the scent of pine and old firewood filling the space. Max moved through the house quickly, circling each room, his tail high as he checked every corner, every familiar scent. Ethan let out a soft breath, shaking his head. "Still on patrol, huh?" Max returned to his side, sitting down with a quiet, expectant huff. Ethan lowered himself carefully onto the worn couch, letting his body relax for the first time in what felt like years. The weight of the hospital, of survival, of loss and fear, melted away as he exhaled. Max curled up beside him, his head resting on Ethan's knee. They were home. For a long time, neither of them moved. Ethan's fingers ran absently through Max's fur, his mind drifting. He had come so close, to never seeing this place again, to never feeling the warmth of the fire, the creak of the floorboards, the quiet stillness of the mountains beyond these walls. And yet, here he was, because of Max. Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening slightly. "I don't deserve you, you know," he murmured. Max lifted his head slightly, ears pricking forward. Ethan let out a shaky chuckle. "You're supposed to disagree." Max huffed, his tail thumping once against the floor. Ethan smiled. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and fresh snow. The storm had passed, the world had moved on. But Ethan and Max remained. Survivors, together. And this time, nothing would take them apart again. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth, filling the cabin with a warmth that neither Ethan nor Max had felt in weeks. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of snow and pine. But it was no longer a threat. It was simply the voice of the wilderness, one Ethan had learned to respect and one Max had conquered. Ethan sat on the worn leather couch, his leg propped up on a makeshift ottoman, still healing but no longer fragile. He had been through hell, had come closer to death than he ever wanted to admit, but every breath he took now was a reminder of the life he had fought for. The life Max had refused to let slip away. Max lay stretched out beside the couch, his thick coat gleaming in the firelight. His body was leaner than before, his muscles still recovering from the brutal journey through the mountains, but his spirit remained unbroken. His ears twitched at the crackling wood, his deep brown eyes flicking up toward Ethan, watching, always watching. "You never gave up on me," Ethan murmured, running his fingers through Max's fur. Max let out a soft huff, shifting closer. Ethan chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You probably don't even realize what you did." His voice was rough, thick with emotion. "You saved me, Max. More than once. You could have left, could have found your way back without me. But you didn't." Max blinked up at him, unwavering, because of course he hadn't. That wasn't who he was. That wasn't what loyalty meant. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back into the couch. His fingers curled into Max's fur, grounding himself in the warmth, the presence of the dog who had refused to let him go. For 30 days, Max had braved the wilderness alone. He had fought against the bitter cold, against hunger, against fear and exhaustion. He had tracked Ethan's fading scent through the storm, refusing to accept what nature tried to take from him. That wasn't just survival. That was love. Unwavering, unshakable love. And Ethan knew, deep in his bones, that no matter what came next, no matter what storms would try to break them again, They would face it together, because some bonds couldn't be broken, not by time, not by distance, not even by death. Ethan glanced down at Max, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You ready for whatever comes next, buddy?" Max thumped his tail against the wooden floor once. A simple answer. Of course. Always. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of loyalty, survival, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their best friends. Like, share, and comment below, because every dog deserves a story like Max's.